Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'm very excited to be here today with Derek Ansel, who's Global Vice President and Therapeutic Strategy Lead for Rare Disease and Oncology at Worldwide Clinical Trials. Derek is a board-certified genetic counselor, and he's built a career at the intersection of clinical trial design, genetic testing, and patient engagement, and has worked on some really transformative therapies over the years. So we're going to talk about his journey into the field. We're going to talk about some of the new FDA frameworks, plausible mechanism, and of one therapies, and in general, where CROs like Worldwide Clinical Trials fit into the whole therapeutic development landscape. So Derek, thank you for taking the time to join me.
Thanks, Patrick. Glad to be here.
I'd love to start, for people that aren't familiar with this space, what is a CRO exactly? How does it fit into the broader drug development ecosystem?
Sure. So we love our acronyms in the industry, and CRO is no different. It stands for Contract Research Organization. So we run mainly clinical trials. The company I work for runs end-to-end clinical trials for our biotech and pharmaceutical partners. So we typically call ourselves full service. Again, a company might come to us with a particular asset, a disease in mind, and that's it. And we kind of take it from there. We draft up all of the required documents and ultimately run the trial. There's some specialized CROs, if you will, some that focus on certain functional areas that are very nuanced or very niche, that require specialized expertise or specialized skills. But the larger CROs out there that often work with the largest pharmaceutical companies can do, everything under their one kind of umbrella or remit.
If we think about some of the rare disease clinical trials you've worked on, and we can keep it general or feel free to share examples if you're able to, take me to that beginning point where we've got this particular molecule or asset and this disease that we're going after, and you need to design a protocol, you need to come up with a strategy for how you're going to actually take it through clinical trials. What are some of the big questions in rare disease in particular that often come up at that early stage?
Yeah. Great question. I feel like endpoints. I would be remiss if I don't mention endpoints. Endpoints are kind of the bane of our rare disease existence, right? We don't know a lot about these rare indications and rare disorders. I mean, some we do. Some are very well researched. Some have a number of approved products, but the vast majority, there's no approved products. And some of the challenges that we see are because of just how heterogeneous the symptoms are. What you might see in one rare disease patient is completely different to the next rare disease patient. And I often think of the neurodevelopmental disorders. They can have a wide spectrum of symptoms. They can have a wide spectrum of regression, just how much they regress, what skill sets are being regressed, and some have no regression or might have an onset of seizures or never develop seizures. So when you start to think about how do you measure if a drug is efficacious in a rare disease patient population, well, it can be rare or non-rare. You have to select that endpoint. What is that measure that's going to show, yes, drug is efficacious or, superior to placebo? And the challenge in rare is how do you pick just one? So there's been a lot of conversation for many, many years of those challenges. How do we perhaps use composite endpoints, or how do we use certain pieces of other assessments to help create kind of a novel endpoint to help justify or really validate the efficaciousness, if you will, of the drug? That's hard to do, right? It's easy for me to sit here and say, well, if there are no endpoints, let's just come up with one.
Yeah.
The challenge is you can come up with a lot of different endpoints, but again, if it's your pharmaceutical company's one shot on goal, if this is what's going to get your drug approved, you have to be relatively reassured that this endpoint's going to show you what you need it to show. And then the second step is that the FDA has to be able to accept it, or other health agencies around the globe have to be able to accept that endpoint as well. So anytime you're in a rare disease, I feel like you can't have a podcast without discussing endpoints.
Yeah, I when you mentioned endpoints, the problem that I immediately went to in my mind was we don't have one that is agreed by the field or by the FDA that it's a good enough clinical endpoint. But you raised a second one, which is also really important, which is the heterogeneity. If you have a multi-system disorder, how do you pick just one thing, or do you combine them in some way? And those are obviously related. But what do you do to answer that question? Are there go-to data sets? Do you need to run natural history studies? And it'd be good if you could explain some of the tools in the toolkit to try to answer some of those questions.
Of course. I'm very lucky to work with an amazing team within Worldwide. We have a group that really, they do much more than this, but I tend to think that this is what their bread and butter is, really supporting us and determining, is there any sort of precedent out there from any other health agency? Are there other endpoints from other similar diseases that we could reference as to why we're picking this endpoint over the other? Really doing a literature review. Again, and a lot of those individuals within that team are PhD individuals. So they have that translational science expertise to really dig into that asset, really dig into the tox data, for example, and to see where, uncover areas of where we could look for additional endpoints. What my team and I focus on is how do we operationalize that? So once that endpoint is selected, once that synopsis kind of drafted, how do then we actually put that in the clinic? How does that impact our patients and our families? How does that impact standard of care? How does that impact if there's drugs already available? Does that at all impede this patient's ability to get access to other therapies? So admittedly, I'm not the best regulatory expert when it comes to selecting endpoints. But again, thankful to have a group that's really their bread and butter, is to select something out of all of the noise with our goal of giving you a signal. That's kind of like our mantra within our organization. As a CRO, our job is to give you a signal, whether the drug, worked or didn't work. It's to kind of reduce that noise, reduce that clutter, get you some certainty with endpoint selection, patient population selection as well. Because as we mentioned, the heterogeneity also can be controlled by narrowly selecting patients via inclusion-exclusion criteria. So obviously, if you pick a very broad endpoint, you need to narrow your patient population. So it kind of the inverse affects one another. So again, it's that conversation with that group and the sponsor around where they ultimately see their drug being commercialized in what patient population.
Yeah, you hit exactly on the next area I wanted to go with this. I think you laid out a really nice framework for this. So the job is to get, we don't want to run a clinical trial and still have a high degree of uncertainty, right? You want to have some signal of whether we're on the right track and we should keep investing and pursuing, or we've designed a trial effectively to say we're actually not on the right track and we need to learn something from that as well. But how do you actually select the patient population can be a huge operational impact as well, right? Like you said, if you narrowly define the population, you could control some of that heterogeneity, but you might make the trial harder to run. How do you go about actually making that decision? Like if we think about a gene therapy, you could go really early in patients where they're not quite as sick yet, and maybe you expect to have a bigger impact, but you have to design a trial that runs for way longer, or you can go a lot later in patients that are a little bit more sick, but maybe you don't, maybe it's too late. How do you think about, going out of anecdotes and people will come to these with a lot of strong opinions, right? But you need to figure out some way to actually make a clear and principled decision. How do you do that?
If I had that concrete answer, right? I don't know that we'd be sitting here because I think I'd be well retired in some amazing island. And I think that's the challenge, right? It's all of these elements of your program interplay. And for many of the biotech companies that we work with, there's no room for error. But we see this all the time. Errors are made in certain endpoints that have been selected, or the incorrect inclusion exclusion criteria were selected. Perhaps we were too broad in our patient population, or perhaps we were too narrow in a patient population. And this is happening all the time. So I don't think anyone has kind of the appropriate crystal ball. Where we feel relatively, and I guess I feel relatively reassured, is when I first started in rare disease a bit ago, the lack of precedent was immense. I kind of felt like we were making something out of nothing, right? We didn't know, and I still think there are a number of rare disorders that are very much like that. But there's so much that we can learn from other indications, whether they're rare or non-rare. There's so much that we can learn from other vastly different indications of the symptomology might be beneficial for the other. So it's not that I have a great answer of how do we do that. It really does depend on the particular drug asset and what their commercialization goals are. Everyone wants to be able to have, everyone meaning pharma and biotech, want to have the most broadly applicable label they can get. But sometimes it is easier, what we call rarefication of certain diseases, to start small and narrow, measure that signal before you start to become more broad. Because again, the concern is if you're broader in your patient population, again, going back to what I originally said, there might be a lot of noise in that signal. You're not sure why you're seeing what you're seeing because you started in a wider patient population, or you selected an endpoint that probably should have been a secondary, not a primary, or a co-primary, or a composite. So there's all of these implications, or selections have direct implications into kind of reducing that risk. So it's kind of hard for me to answer kind of how do we always do that, because it is wildly different for every customer that we work with.
One of the things that's also shifting right now is the way the FDA and other regulatory agencies are looking at rare disease trials. Have been recent announcements about a plausible mechanism pathway from the FDA. I know you and your team are probably looking and thinking about the implications of this a lot. Could you, for people who aren't familiar, just talk about that for a minute? What do we think the impact is going to be on rare disease trials, and what is the new mechanism?
Yeah, we're very excited to hear what the FDA is saying in general when it comes to rare diseases, in terms of the priority review vouchers and getting that back into mainstream approval, if you will, lack of better words, but also the plausibility mechanism. I think, again, it recognizes that there needs to be some flexibility when it comes to rare disease, especially as companies are starting to target more N of 1. Or using the same kind of asset mechanism to support a wide range of rare diseases without having to do the same drug development program over and over again. So I think it represents for the first time a collection of the FDA's thoughts on how do we reduce that red tape and how do we accelerate drug development for rare diseases. So I'm excited to hear it. I'm looking forward to seeing it in practice. Many of our customers are interested to see how it can be widely used in their instance. It is early, as most FDA guidances that have released at this time, but we're encouraged to see it move forward. Likewise, just like as we saw for the Rare Disease Innovation Hub that was announced a couple of years ago, it really focused on making sure CDER and CBER had, a communication pathway. Again, it's great to see that FDA is focusing on reducing those barriers. It's great to see those web pages being developed and refreshed around how the community can engage with FDA through those programs, but we recognize there are, early barriers to that, right? It's still early days, still early in the program. Again, we're kind of waiting with bated breath to see just how fast drug development can move within rare disease under these frameworks, but the fact that FDA are saying that these mechanisms are plausible, pun may be intended there, I think it's exciting for us in the rare disease space.
And genetics is obviously front and center of this plausible mechanism framework, because if we have a monogenic condition, then you have very strong evidence that disrupting or causing gain of function or whatever it might be in this particular gene is causal to the condition that you're studying. You have a genetic counseling background, so you have a unique insight, I think, into these genetically driven trials. As more of the clinical trial portfolio becomes genetically driven, how do you think about patient engagement, communication, and also bridging the different, I guess, gaps in access and education between patients, clinicians, sponsors for some of these very novel test types?
Yeah, I love that question. One of my many soapboxes are on the role of genetic counselors in genetically driven drug development. How many times can we say genetics in this podcast? But I can't think of a better role to help facilitate that with the public. As we start to see more and more gene therapies become mainstream, and they already are mainstream, right? And I kind of, we see that in the news all the time about gene editing and gene therapy. They're out there, and we're only going to see more of them, particularly as we mentioned, N-of-1 therapies as well. Genetic counselors are often involved very early on in the diagnostic process. And one of the key areas genetic counselors counsel family members on is, do you ultimately pursue genetic testing? And in certain diseases, that's largely driven by the medical management. And many who choose to pursue genetic testing really do it if it means anything in terms of their medical management. Will these results do anything for me medically? Will I take a new treatment because of these results? Or should I consider other treatments because of these results? For many disorders, there's no answer to that. We don't know how the test results impact medical management, but we would uncover a genetic cause potentially. But as these gene therapies, gene editing, any gene-derived therapeutic that impacts your based upon your genetics or should be administered because of your genetics, that's going to increase, right? I think that motivation is certainly going to increase. So genetic counselors, and one of the things I often talk about at conferences is how do we kind of equip genetic counselors to handle these conversations? Many patients, the public, the laymen out there are well educated, right? They're seeing these things in the news, they're Googling, they are coming to clinics with these questions. I know my child has this genetic disorder. I know there are no drugs approved, but so-and-so has a phase 1 study. Should I hold off on this surgery or should I wait for this drug to be approved? Yeah. Right? I mean, what a powerful, well-researched parent there in that situation. So I think from a well-educated genetic counselor that right knows about clinical trials, but also knows around the challenges around commercialization and access and reimbursement is well equipped to answer that question, because it's not just a yes or no type of question. So that's going to keep happening, right? And that if you kind of expand that into other spaces where maybe they're not served by genetic counselors, but other physicians who might not be genetically educated, the concern around those education and consent pathways can be very concerning. So what do you mean? Why am I concerned? So for example, as we all know, for gene therapy programs, they're often one and done, especially in the investigational context. So if you choose to enroll often, right, look at the particular clinical study that you're looking to enroll in. But for many of those, one of the inclusion-exclusion criteria or the requirements for participation is that you could not have received another gene therapy. So that, again, if you are in a disease area where there's a very mature pipeline of potential gene therapy candidates, how do you even begin to educate a parent on the pros and cons of these various therapies? What types of tools do you use to help guide your discussion? What data, if any, should be reviewed before having a conversation with that family around a particular asset? And one could argue, really, does anyone have typically you're just prescribed a drug by a physician. Rarely are given multiple choices of which drug would you like. So there's just so many logistical, ethical, insurance-based, future-based questions that I think genetic counselors are really well equipped to handle those conversations. But if we see this explosion of gene-based therapeutics, there aren't enough genetic counselors to handle those conversations globally. So we need to kind of not only educate the community, the public, but also educate the scientific community as well on all of the various aspects I just mentioned.
Are you starting to see more genetic subtypes of common disease when we, as you know, we work on both rare diseases in the traditional sense, rare monogenic, but if I think about something like Parkinson's disease, you've got 2 subtype or GBA subtype, and you have a different issue there, I think, which is in a rare monogenic disease, often the clinicians they really understand the genetics because it's central to the condition. It is thought of as a genetic condition, but in some of these genetic subtypes of common disease, you get a real spectrum, right, of patients as well as clinicians and their level of understanding of the role genetics plays in the condition or in the treatment choice.
Completely agree. I think your Parkinson's example is an important one, not only just for the physicians, but also the patients. Right? I think when I look at monogenic, kind of tried and true rare diseases, that ecosystem is very different, right? All the way from the physicians to how patients find information or how patients are motivated by information, rightfully so, right? But when I think about Parkinson's disease and GBA1 or LRRK2, it's a very different patient engagement paradigm, if you will. The tools and techniques that we use in a maybe like Angelman syndrome are very different than I would for GBA1 Parkinson's disease. The motivations are different, right? You can have Parkinson's disease and not need to ever know you have a genetic etiology of Parkinson's disease, right? So I think the motivations are different, but if you can compare and contrast Parkinson's disease and multiple system atrophy, right? One can argue MSA, or the literature really says MSA is a fatal, more severe form of Parkinson's disease. I mean, if you clump them together, you can act and treat as if it's Parkinson's disease. But when you start to rarefy them, right, it is a very different patient base in terms of their motivations, their challenges, their expectations of therapies, than you would if you compared that with a GBA1 Parkinson's patient, for example. And I'm generalizing here, but those are kinds of the examples of how we kind of educate our drug developers on, you can't just take, even though I mentioned earlier on, could we potentially use similar information to help select endpoints? Sure. But when you're looking to motivate, engage, educate, and make your patients aware of these genetics and what that means for them, it's very different for any disease, but also disease within a disease, right? So when you look at some forms of kidney disease, and you're starting to kind of peel back the layers of genetics around kidney disease, you start to uncover, well, how are they getting diagnosed? And you might just think, well, your nephrologist is doing it. Well, years ago, nephrology rarely did genetic testing. Now we are seeing nephrologists do the lion's share of genetic testing, and it's kind of changing that diagnostic paradigm. Whereas years ago, I would have said, you need to focus more on the genetics clinics to get access to kidney patients that have a confirmed genetic diagnosis. Now that's completely out the window. So again, it not only does it change how you interact and engage with physicians, it's now you have to look for those new gaps in that change of that diagnostic journey and kind of plug in as you go. If patients are now, getting a quicker, a more efficient diagnosis, which is always our goal, but that still doesn't mean that there isn't educational gaps, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned N of 1 therapies earlier, which is the extreme end of rarefication, and there have been amazing technological demonstrations, and nonprofits like N-Lorem Foundation, I think, have treated 50 plus families, patients with these individually printed ASOs. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the future there, and in particular, what do you think needs to change for N of 1 therapies to become scalable, whether it's a commercially viable or something that we could think about as a route for every family someday with one of these ultra rare conditions.
Yeah, I think this is one of the areas we always talk about in rare disease, N of one. And I think it just, rare often has the highest innovation out of necessity, right? So we tend to only think right now N of one in rare, but it will become mainstream again. It will become the norm for non-rare indications, just as much as rare disease has been for non-rare for many, many years. What is encouraging, again, is the FDA sentiment around N of one. So we already spoke around the regulatory kind of confirmation for supporting N of one of precision-based medicines going forward. I think the challenge that we see is, or something that needs to be really focused on, is the financial aspect of that. There aren't enough companies working in this space for a variety of reasons. It's N of one. You're creating a molecule for one patient that is different to what we normally do. Normally, your asset is going to be focused on any number of patients, more than one patient plus one, right? Yes. And beyond. So the fact that this is upsetting kind of the paradigm in terms of drug development, I think we're finally getting there with drug development. This has been done before, so we know that there's a common path there. It's the reimbursement aspect. How do we make this acceptable with insurance carriers? I mean, we have this issue on gene therapies now that aren't N of one. So this is something that we definitely need to figure out when we think about scalability. And I'm not even getting into the manufacturing aspect of any of this. Just once it's approved, how do we then reimburse those who, spent time, effort, and energy to support that? Many of this requires venture capital funding, which might not look attractive for many VC firms for obvious reasons. There's been a couple of companies that have come to mind that have lost their funding for N of one type therapies. So again, this is an area of the future. We're going to see more and more of these, but we certainly aren't if there's no financial backing. And I think one of the areas for that financial backing is just the uncertainty that we historically have seen with FDA, but also the uncertainty with commercial insurance carriers. How will this be widely accessible for patients post-approval?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. Where are you seeing AI impact clinical development today? We can think of use cases across the whole spectrum, from actually designing and discovering endpoints, but there's also maybe more mundane use cases like document analysis and management. Where are you seeing the biggest impact, and where are you expecting to see it in the future?
Yeah, AI is all the rage right now, right? I feel like you can't go to any conference without being assaulted by the various AI sessions. One of the conferences I went to last year, I actually did an AI talk on basically just come here if you don't really know where you should go when it comes to AI. And anyway, if I can, self-reflect, I tried to set it up in a way that really answered your question. What is the industry doing with AI? What elements can you maybe think about using in your own practice? Versus those sessions that really talk about, we come to our talk because we've uncovered the truth of AI. I mean, everyone kind of talks about it with such a positive spin. But anyway, I digress. You're right. I think AI in our industry is being applied in every avenue. How can we reduce? A lot of what we do in clinical trials is very manual. We are reinventing the wheel every step of the way. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One, it's a tightly regulated industry, as we all know. But as I mentioned earlier on, just because you're running one study in the same disease again that you did 5 years ago, things have changed. So it's often just the way of doing things is in a manual environment. Now, there are some automation that's been done in the industry as we think about kind of moving into electronic data capture. That was a big to-do, and now it's so standard for us today. So I do think AI it's here to stay. I think there are some companies that are using AI for good, meaning they're not leveraging AI to get rid of entire workforces or work staff or functional areas. They're they are empowering their human workforce to leverage AI to make them faster and smarter, to be able to do more with less, which I know sounds cringy, but there is something to be said around empowering your workforce to become augmented by the power that is AI. It's some examples of where the industry's been using AI is, we use a lot of documents, of course, right? So leveraging AI in the way that we scan, sort, submit QC documents, the way that we generate documents, the way that we review that information for accuracy. And that has profound implications from the items that we mentioned in designing your protocol, leveraging AI to do that for you, leveraging AI tools to help review that precedent and sentiment of various programs to help create a well-rounded clinical synopsis. One of the areas that we're seeing right now is there's a lot of databases that we build. That patient data goes somewhere. That's the whole point of a clinical trial, is to review that patient data and confirm the drug is doing what it's supposed to be doing. That takes time to build. That is very nuanced. That requires a lot of understanding of the disease. And how do we, again, appropriately capture that data? And can we measure those changes in a sensitive way? Leveraging AI to help kickstart that is something that I'm seeing the industry focus on. So, of course, I think for the very manual, labor-intensive processes, when we're reviewing safety events, for example, instead of having a team of physicians really review that at a granular level, I mean, that takes so much time and effort. Using AI to summarize the data, filter the data, but still that team of physicians are still reviewing at the end of the day. So it's only, again, I think we're going to see drug development faster. But it is early days, right? I don't think anyone can truly say they're using AI every step of the way. I think I would be cautious of companies that would say that, because, you need to keep, the word human in the loop, or the phrase human in the loop. I think it's okay to be rightfully hesitant in leveraging AI in every aspect. In fact, in my talk, it really focused on don't boil the ocean. We don't do well as an industry when we boil the ocean. Pick one area as a pilot, as a use case scenario, put those measures and controls in place and see if it actually makes things quicker, better, faster. If it doesn't, move on, versus trying to, full scale roll out an AI platform or algorithm for every functional area. We barely have the time and effort and resources to get our drugs approved, if you think about it, right? So let alone a full-scale AI platform for these companies is just untenable. So I think if you're looking to leverage AI, start small, but I do think it is something that every company in our industry is talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think upstream, when you're designing the trial, definitely when you're doing the original discovery work, if you've got the data foundation in place, there's a lot you can do with AI. The further you get into trials, the more the blocker becomes real world things, right? How fast can we get this site activated? How fast can we get regulatory approvals? And you can speed up your part of that, right? But you still have the university approval system, or the EMA or FDA regulator. Over time, probably both of these sides of the coin will speed up, but there's a bottleneck that sometimes isn't something you can control in drug development right now, right?
And you can't be and I think that's the hesitancy. You can't be wrong with these approaches. We've all have seen hallucinations in the use of AI. In fact, you can even orchestrate them on your own. So again, if you're a biotech company and you have limited funds, so I think I've explained 99.9% of all biotech companies out there, you want to be rest assured that your AI is not creating hallucinations or creating fraudulent information or making up information, because that will sink not only your asset but your entire company. So again, I think I kind of put AI in the same bucket as decentralized clinical trials a couple of years ago. And then a couple of years before that, patient centricity. I think they're all very important, but they started out as buzzwords. But when you start to ask people, but how? How are you actually using AI? I think we all can remember from the early days, how are you leveraging DCT? How are you actually defining patient centricity? It was like crickets, right? So I think, again, AI is another one of those. But I think we can all take our lessons learned from those other buzzword initiatives, such as DCTs and patient centricity, and really create a robust framework versus, again, I think when COVID hit, we all thought, well, we'll never do an clinical trial ever again. We're right back where we started from, right? I mean, I think it at least had the conversation. We at least now have frameworks and motivations to have more decentralized visits for many of the clinical trials that we run. But if you think about rare disease, often what is the utility of leveraging decentralized clinical trials? Is it to make things cheaper, or is it to make it easier for the participant? So again, those are the conversations you also need to be having for AI. So I kind of treat those all as the same kind of umbrella, even though they're very different terms and tools and initiatives, but we need to be treating them the same way and not treating them as the Hail Mary that will, reinvent the way that we do clinical trials. Maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe in 30 years, we'll look back at this and go, okay, well, I was completely wrong now that we have AI running every clinical development program. But I just think we need to treat it in a hesitant manner because not everyone has unlimited funds. If you were an unlimited funded biotech company with no risk, sure, I'm sure you're going to be able to do some very cool things with AI. But again, you only have one shot for many of these companies and assets. And I find many are unwilling to just plug everything into AI.
Yeah, not yet. You started your career, I think, in genetic counseling, or at least that was what you originally, that's the track you were originally on, but you found your way into clinical research. Can you tell the story about what got you interested in genetic counseling, and then also how you found your way to drug development?
Yeah, it was actually kind of the other way around. I always wanted to be a genetic counselor, but I didn't get accepted right after undergrad. But while I was waiting for those rejections to come in, I was already working in clinical research. I was a bench scientist working on vaccine products that were already being used. And we're just, again, testing the efficacy of those vaccines. And I told myself, okay, I'll give myself 2 years in this field, and then I'll apply for genetic counseling again. I did not. I changed into clinical operations, and I became kind of entrenched in rare disease ever since. And it was actually during the pandemic, and chatting with a lot of great colleagues, patient advocates, genetic counselors, that kind of convinced me to try it again. So I was already kind of in my current role. I was very fortunate for my current company when I got accepted to see the value of having a board certified and licensed genetic counselor on staff. I thought I knew a thing or two about genetic testing until I went through a genetic counseling program. So it's been immensely helpful, but I kind of went the other way.
What were the biggest things you learned? What that you said you thought you knew a lot? What did you learn through that process?
The technology. I think, we would see a protocol of we're going to be using, or just like the carefree uses of the terminology, sequencing versus genotyping.
Right.
Like your protocol has 6 versions of sequencing, and now you're saying karyotyping, and now you're saying genotyping. Like makes no sense.
Yeah.
Or I mean, a lot of my role is really a consultative role. Again, working with these biotech companies around the nuance that rare diseases has. And genetic testing is a huge nuance in terms of the turnaround time, in terms of that access. Well, most patients have already pursued genetic testing. What is panel testing versus whole exome and whole genome? Is it quicker? Is it faster if we do one over the other? Why would we? What is typically done in the clinic? And how does that impact kind of the protocol design? I think pre-genetic counseling years, I was not equipped to be able to answer all of those questions. Now that I'm still in the clinic today a little bit, seeing patients, seeing how that's done and how it affects the clinical research world has been immensely helpful, that I just wouldn't have if I didn't go through a genetic counseling program. So I'm immensely grateful that I was able to be accepted into a program that both Worldwide and my program were very flexible with me being full-time in both, full-time employment, full-time genetic counseling program. But the value of the degree was just so helpful. So again, if you're an aspiring genetic counseling student or a genetic counseling graduate, or soon to be a genetic counseling graduate, there's a whole world outside of the traditional genetic counseling pathway, such as clinical research, where we very much need your skills and knowledge. That if you're looking for a non-clinician role, there's so much to be done in the clinical research space. And again, as I mentioned early on, that is one of my soapboxes. So please don't hesitate to reach out, and I will certainly talk your ear off as to how the industry can very much see the value of a genetic counseling student or a graduate student.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know we have a lot of GCs that listen to this podcast. Last question for you, Derek. What are you most excited about in the next 5 years for rare disease and precision medicine? It could be technology, could be new changes in commercial regulatory landscape, or something else I'm not thinking about.
Yeah, I think all of the above. Again, I think rare disease is always an exciting time. I think if you'd asked me this question last year, my responses would have been a little bit different. But I'm excited that we kind of re-engaged regulators on the importance of drug development for rare diseases, particularly in N of 1. I think we are getting better in the way that we educate patients and community members on these very complex therapeutics. We're getting much better at that intersection of, again, genetic testing and what these results can mean for you and your family, particularly as we think about therapies. More of these drugs getting approved really supports, again, that motivation behind genetic testing. So I just think they all build on one another. When we start to see government and agency support for rare diseases, we're going to see more funding in drug development, which means we're going to see more approved drugs for our patients and our families, which means our insurance carriers are going to be reimbursing and ensuring access, hopefully, again, for those with the most unmet need. We're going to start to see with AI more of these nonprofits focusing on leveraging AI with the goal of getting these drugs to patients faster. So again, we represent just the traditional clinical development pathway, but there are other ways of getting drugs to patients by leveraging technology and data. And I think rare disease is the kind of originator, if you will, of that innovation. We have these massive data sets, natural history studies, and registries because we didn't know what endpoint to select. So again, going back to what I just said from the very beginning, so imagine what we can do with that data when it comes to commercialization, when it comes to reimbursement, when it comes to knowing that natural history of one disease, how we can apply that to others. And we're going to be able to do that faster with things like AI. So I'm just excited in general for all of the above. Because the innovation will continue to come, and the innovation is always seen in rare disease first. I'm a little biased to say that. So when we start to see that excitement and justification for rare disease research that we have seen in 2026, that means we're going to see that investment innovation in non-rare disorders as well. So they're kind of like I feel like they're your canary in the coal mine, right? If we start to see that investment in innovation focus from FDA, which we have thus far, it's going to mean great things for not only rare disease, but also non-rare indications as well.
Yeah, amazing. Well, Derek, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Patrick, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure was mine. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the Genetics Podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, as always, for tuning into the Genetics Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, the best way you can support the show is by sharing it with a friend or colleague who might find it interesting as well. We'd also really appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps other people discover the show when they're searching for content on genetics, precision medicine, or biotech. We always want to hear from you as well. If you have feedback or questions or want to be featured on the show, you can email us at podcast@sonogenetics.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Patrick Short. You can find us as well, Sonogenetics, on LinkedIn, or reach out on Instagram at The Genetics Podcast. And finally, a special thank you to the team behind the show who makes this possible. Joy Ismail produces and manages the show. Jane Reddy-Webster keeps us organized, and James Pierce from Selective Frequencies for his expert audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.